Ryan and Emily Carter looked like the perfect couple until the day she vanished without a trace, and the truth revealed he had sold her to drug traffickers to erase a debt he couldn't pay. Ryan and Emily Carter lived in a modest two-story home in Spring, Texas, just north of Houston. Their neighbors often described them as the perfect couple, young, attractive, and always polite. Emily, a registered nurse at a nearby hospital, had a calm, steady presence. She loved gardening, took evening walks with her dog, and often volunteered at the local community center. Ryan ran a small construction business, mostly residential remodeling, and was known for his charm and easy smile. They had been together since high school, and married by the time they were 22. Now, 8 years later, they were still childless, but talked often of starting a family. To anyone watching, they looked like a couple with nothing to hide. But there was a growing darkness in their home, one that Emily couldn't see. While she worked long shifts and picked up extra hours to save for their dream vacation to Italy, Ryan was slowly spiraling. His construction business, which had once shown promise, had started crumbling under poor management, inconsistent contracts, and the rising cost of materials. He kept this hidden from Emily, afraid of disappointing her. Pride kept him from asking for help. Instead, he made a decision that would send both of their lives into a nightmare. It began with a short-term loan, a quick fix, Ryan told himself. Just a few $1,000s to cover payroll and supplies for a major kitchen renovation that was already behind schedule. But when that job fell through, his client backing out unexpectedly, Ryan was left with no way to repay what he owed. The lender wasn't a bank or a licensed company. It was a group he had met through an old acquaintance. Men who didn't ask many questions. Men who charged steep interest and collected in person. At first, Ryan made payments, but each month, it became harder. He stopped answering phone calls, ignored the knocks at the door, and hoped the problem would go away. That's when the warnings started. Someone keyed his truck. One morning, he found a bullet lodged in his mailbox. Another night, after coming home late, he noticed Emily's car had been tampered with. Brake lines cut clean. He fixed it without telling her, said it was a manufacturing recall. He didn't want to scare her, but deep down, he knew things were slipping out of his control. By the time Ryan owed over $30,000, the threats turned personal. A photo of Emily taken at work was sent to his phone. A text followed. Beautiful wife. Shame if something happened to her. That was the moment he realized the danger he'd brought into their lives. He stayed up nights pacing the living room, calculating options he didn't have. Emily noticed his anxiety but attributed it to stress. He was drinking more, smoking again, and spending hours alone in the garage. When she asked, he brushed it off, said it was just work. Emily continued with her life, unaware of the invisible countdown ticking inside her home. She still believed in her husband, still trusted him. She had no idea he had started visiting bars on the edge of town, meeting with men whose names he never spoke aloud. No idea he had stood outside their bedroom one night, staring at her through the crack in the door, wondering what price he'd be willing to pay to make his problems disappear. Ryan told himself he was protecting her, that if he could just hold on a little longer, he'd find a way out. But he was lying to himself. With every day that passed, the pressure mounted. The men he owed grew more impatient. One day, they followed Emily home from work. Ryan watched through the window as the black SUV slowly drove past their house twice before speeding away. His hands trembled. He knew what was coming next. The truth was, Ryan had already crossed a line. He just didn't realize how far he would go until he was forced to choose between paying his debt with money or with something much more valuable. Something he could never get back. And in that moment, buried beneath shame, fear, and desperation, Ryan Carter made a decision that would change everything. Ryan's fear turned into panic as the deadline approached. The men he owed had stopped calling. They weren't making threats anymore. Not out loud. Now it was silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. He started sleeping with the lights on, checking the locks 3 times before bed, and keeping a baseball bat near the front door. Emily noticed how jumpy he'd become. She attributed it to stress and exhaustion. He wasn't eating much. He stared into space during dinner. His hands shook when he poured his coffee. She asked if he needed a break from work, but he brushed her off, saying business was just unpredictable. In truth, there was no business. The company was all but finished. The accounts were overdrawn, the work truck had been repossessed, and his employees had walked off the job weeks earlier after unpaid wages. Ryan had burned every bridge in town. He owed money to suppliers, subcontractors, and now, the worst people imaginable. Every day that passed without payment was another day closer to something terrible. The final message came in the form of a package on their doorstep. No return address. Inside, a single item. Emily's hospital ID badge. Ryan's heart sank. He hadn't told them where she worked. He hadn't told them anything about her. But they had found out on their own. And now they were letting him know just how easily they could reach her. Later that night, Ryan was told to show up at an abandoned warehouse on the east side of town. No questions, no delays. He didn't tell Emily where he was going. He said he had to meet a potential investor, one last shot at saving the company. She smiled and wished him luck. That was the last time Ryan would ever see her as the woman who still believed in him. The warehouse smelled like oil and rot. 2 men waited in the shadows, both armed. Ryan handed over a small envelope containing what little money he had managed to gather, barely a dent in the debt. They laughed at him. One of them, tall with tattoos covering his neck, leaned in and asked if Ryan was serious about wanting to survive. Ryan nodded, sweat pouring down his back. Then came the offer. They would forgive the debt, wipe it clean. No interest, no future collection. In exchange, they wanted something more personal. Someone. Emily. Ryan's heart nearly stopped. At first he thought it was a joke, some sick test of loyalty or desperation. But they were serious. They said Emily could be useful to them, that she would be treated well enough. They said she was beautiful, that people paid a lot for someone like her. Ryan couldn't speak. He shook his head, backed away, said he'd rather die. But they just stared at him coldly and told him to think it over. He had 24 hours. The next day was a blur. Ryan drove around aimlessly, haunted by the proposal. He thought about running, disappearing with Emily and starting over somewhere far away. But he had no money, no fake IDs, and nowhere to go. He thought about going to the police, but he knew that would only make things worse. These men weren't just criminals. They were part of something bigger, something untouchable. If he crossed them, he was as good as dead. Worse, so was Emily. He came home that night to find Emily on the couch, watching TV in her scrubs, her head resting sleepily on a pillow. She smiled when he walked in. He stood there silently, staring at her, feeling his stomach churn. He told himself there had to be another way. But as the night dragged on, and as the clock ticked toward the next deadline, his mind began to break. The next morning, Ryan made the call. He didn't speak her name. He simply said he was in. The plan was set. Emily would be taken without a trace. She wouldn't see it coming. Ryan didn't ask for the details. He didn't want to know. All he had to do was make sure she was alone at the right time, at the right place. He agreed. When the call ended, Ryan stared at his reflection in the mirror. He didn't recognize the man looking back. He'd always thought of himself as a good person who had made a few bad choices. But now, he had become something else, something much worse, and there was no going back. It was a Friday evening when everything fell apart. Emily never came home. She had left for work that morning like always, coffee in hand, hair pulled into a neat bun, her nurse's badge clipped to her chest. She had been scheduled for a 12-hour shift at the hospital. But when the clock hit midnight and Ryan hadn't heard from her, he called her phone. No answer. At first, he acted concerned. At least, that's what he told himself. Maybe she stayed late. Maybe her battery died. He even left a voicemail, voice shaking just enough to sound believable. By sunrise, her car was found parked behind an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The driver's side door was ajar. Her phone was discovered nearby, its screen shattered, battery missing. Her purse, still full of cash, ID, and credit cards, was found untouched in the back seat. There were no signs of a struggle, no fingerprints, no blood. Just an eerie, deliberate emptiness. Ryan called 911 before the police even showed up at the scene. His performance was convincing. He sobbed on the phone, saying he feared his wife had been kidnapped. When the officers arrived, he recited the timeline carefully, almost rehearsed. Emily left for work at 7 a.m., and he hadn't seen or heard from her since. He claimed he had stayed home all day, working in the garage and fixing a leaky pipe in the kitchen. He said they hadn't been fighting, that their marriage was solid, that he had no enemies. At first, the police had no reason to doubt him. There were no witnesses, no surveillance footage of the area, no signs of forced entry at their home. The case looked like a classic missing person scenario. Flyers with Emily's face were printed and plastered around town. Her co-workers held a candlelight vigil outside the hospital. Ryan showed up, stood quietly in the crowd, and even gave a short speech thanking the community for their support. But as the investigation deepened, so did the questions. Police started digging into Ryan's background. His phone records showed multiple calls to unknown numbers linked to burner phones, numbers that had pinged near known gang activity in the area. Surveillance footage surfaced from a gas station across town. It showed Ryan talking with a man who had been under federal investigation for drug trafficking and organized crime. When detectives asked Ryan about the footage, he claimed it was a former client, someone who had once hired him for a home renovation. He said he hadn't known anything about the man's criminal ties, but the story didn't hold. The man had never owned a home in the area, and no record showed any business between him and Ryan. Emily's family began to grow suspicious. Her sister, Rachel, told investigators that Emily had recently seemed more anxious, mentioning that Ryan had been acting strange and disappearing late at night. She also said Emily had been saving money secretly, planning to leave town for a few days because something didn't feel right at home. Still, there was no hard evidence to tie Ryan to the disappearance. With no body, no weapon, and no confession, the police were stuck. The case remained open but stalled. Reporters camped outside the Carter home, eager for any development. Ryan, once seen as a devoted husband, started to appear more calculated and cold under the public spotlight. He stopped answering questions and retreated indoors. Over the next few weeks, tips flooded in. Psychics, conspiracy theorists, and amateur sleuths all offered their theories. Some believed Emily had staged her own disappearance. Others thought she had been abducted randomly by someone with no connection to her or Ryan. But the detectives on the case couldn't shake the feeling that the husband knew more than he was saying. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. The lead investigator pushed for a deeper look into Ryan's finances. What they found confirmed their suspicions. His accounts were empty. He had taken out multiple short-term loans from shady lenders. One in particular was known for operating through a violent criminal network. But it wasn't enough. Circumstantial evidence wouldn't lead to an arrest. They needed a break, a witness, a confession, a body, something. Until then, Emily's face remained on every telephone pole in town. Her story aired on the local news each night. Her hospital locker stayed untouched, her garden left to wither. And Ryan Carter, the man at the center of it all, kept playing the grieving husband, hiding in plain sight behind a mask he had worn for far too long. Nearly 2 months after Emily vanished, the case seemed frozen in time. The flyers were beginning to peel from street lamps. The neighborhood had grown quiet again, though the whispers continued. Most assumed the worst, though no one said it aloud. Emily's family refused to give up, but even they were starting to prepare themselves for an ending they feared would never bring closure. Then, everything changed. A federal task force conducted a sting operation on a suspected trafficking ring operating between Houston and the Texas-Mexico border. What began as a drug bust expanded rapidly when agents discovered women being held in locked rooms, most of them undocumented, terrified, and injured. Among the arrested was a man known only by the nickname Ghost, a mid-level enforcer for a cartel-backed gang suspected of human trafficking and extortion. Faced with a guaranteed long prison sentence, Ghost agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. In exchange for leniency, he provided names, locations, routes, and stories. One of those stories mentioned a suburban man who had sold his wife to clear a debt. The agents pressed for details. The man described Emily. Nurse, mid-30s, brown hair, bright smile. He even knew the name Ryan. The information was passed along to local authorities in spring. The lead detective on Emily's case, who had always suspected Ryan, felt the chill of truth setting in. The confession connected Ryan to the very people they'd suspected he was involved with. But they still needed more. They needed proof. A story from a desperate gang member wouldn't be enough to arrest him. Ryan, meanwhile, had grown quieter. His face, once expressive in public, had become cold and unreadable. His grief seemed to fade too quickly, and when the media stopped calling, he didn't chase the attention. His neighbors noticed he no longer joined search parties or asked for updates from the police. It was as if he had accepted something privately that no one else knew. A team of investigators kept surveillance on Ryan. They watched his movements, traced his phone records again, and quietly gathered data. One night, they intercepted a call made from one of his old burner phones. The number was flagged and routed through a secure monitoring system. The voice on the other end used code words, but the conversation hinted at coordination. Someone was checking in, someone asking if the package had been noticed. It was the opening they needed. Back on the border, Mexican authorities acted on a tip from Ghost. In a small, heavily guarded ranch near Ciudad Juarez, federal agents raided a property suspected of being a holding site for trafficked women. The operation was dangerous, but successful. A dozen women were found inside, held in cramped, filthy rooms. Among them was a woman matching Emily Carter's description. When the news broke, investigators in Texas scrambled to confirm the identity. Photos were sent. Emily's sister was brought in to identify her. It was her. Bruised, exhausted, underweight, but alive. Rescued nearly 2 months after she was sold by her own husband. Emily's return to the United States was handled quietly, under federal protection. She was placed in a safe location, away from the public and from Ryan, who still had no idea she had been found. After a few days of rest and recovery, Emily agreed to give a statement. What she revealed shocked everyone. She described how she had been abducted, not by strangers, but by men who seemed to know her schedule, her route home, and where to find her when she was alone. She was ambushed after her shift, forced into a van, and driven for hours without knowing where she was going. She was moved several times, kept sedated for part of the journey, and told repeatedly that someone had traded her. When she asked who, the answer was always the same. Your husband. She had refused to believe it. Even when they described him, even when one of the men showed her a picture of Ryan shaking hands with their boss, she denied it. But as the days passed, and no rescue came, and as the threats and violence grew more real, a seed of doubt began to grow. By the time she was rescued, she no longer had any hope that Ryan had been trying to find her. With Emily's full testimony and the earlier confession from the gang member, prosecutors had what they needed. Ryan was arrested at home early one morning, pulled from his bed without warning. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He simply looked down at the floor as he was handcuffed and led out of the house he had once shared with the woman he betrayed. The perfect image was gone. The grieving husband was a lie. And now, the world would see who Ryan Carter really was. The trial of Ryan Carter drew national attention. News stations camped outside the courthouse, their cameras pointed toward the steps as each day brought fresh headlines. The man who had once been viewed as a heartbroken husband was now at the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in recent memory. Public opinion had turned swiftly. People were stunned not only by the cruelty of his crime, but also by how long he had managed to deceive those around him. The prosecution presented their case with methodical precision. They laid out a timeline showing Ryan's mounting debts, his repeated communications with known criminals, and the details of the financial collapse that drove him to desperation. They introduced phone records, text messages, and bank statements that painted a clear picture of a man drowning in obligations he could never meet. But it was Emily's testimony that silenced the courtroom. She walked in quietly, her posture tense but steady. Months of recovery had softened the worst of her physical wounds, but the psychological scars were still visible. Her voice didn't shake when she told the jury how she had been taken, locked away, and treated like a commodity. She described the fear, the confusion, and the slow, soul-crushing realization that she had been betrayed by the one person she thought she could trust completely. She did not cry. She didn't need to. Her words carried more weight than any display of emotion could. The defense tried to argue that Ryan had been manipulated. They claimed he was threatened into cooperating with dangerous people and had made a terrible mistake under pressure. They said he had never intended for Emily to be harmed, that he thought it was only a temporary arrangement to buy time. But the evidence spoke louder. Ryan hadn't made one mistake. He had made a series of calculated choices, each one colder than the last. Witnesses included FBI agents, Emily's co-workers, financial analysts, and even former employees from Ryan's failed business. The most damning came from a cartel associate now under federal protection, who testified that Ryan had personally negotiated Emily's handover. That was when the courtroom turned. Any flicker of sympathy Ryan might have hoped for vanished. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and attempted murder by proxy. The judge, known for his stern demeanor, didn't hold back during sentencing. He called Ryan's actions inhuman, condemning him not only for his betrayal, but for his calculated, emotionless manipulation. Ryan was sentenced to life in federal prison with no possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Ryan didn't flinch. He stared ahead, unmoved, as if the reality of his future hadn't sunk in. Some said he never truly grasped the enormity of what he had done. Others believed he knew exactly what he had become and simply didn't care. Emily didn't stay for the full sentencing. She left the courtroom quietly once the verdict was announced, flanked by her sister and 2 plainclothes officers. The public wanted her to speak. TV shows offered interviews. Publishers reached out about book deals. She declined them all. She wasn't interested in fame or in reliving the trauma again and again. She had already survived what most people couldn't imagine. Now she wanted peace. In the months that followed, Emily slowly rebuilt her life. She moved to a different city under a new name. She changed her profession, working now in advocacy for survivors of trafficking and domestic betrayal. She found meaning in helping others, even if the nightmares sometimes returned. Back in spring, Ryan's former home sat empty for a while before being sold. The neighbors didn't talk about what happened anymore, but they hadn't forgotten. The case remained a grim reminder of how easily appearances can deceive, how evil can wear a friendly face and live quietly behind trimmed hedges and polite smiles. To this day, no one truly understands how Ryan justified what he did. There was no manifesto, no confession of guilt or remorse. He never apologized to Emily, not once. And maybe that's the most chilling part of the story. Because in the end, Ryan Carter didn't just sell his wife. He gave away something far more sacred: trust, love, and humanity. And for that, he paid with the rest of his life.